The story usually begins with noise, crowds filling squares, flags pulled down, statues breaking apart under ropes and cheers. The collapse of the Soviet Union is often framed as a sudden moral failure, a people abandoning an idea they no longer believed in. That version feels dramatic, it feels human, and it feels complete. But it is not where the real collapse begins. This story opens somewhere quieter, far from the cameras. It opens inside government offices where fluorescent lights hum late into the night. Inside ministries where clerks shuffle paper, not slogans. Inside vaults where numbers are supposed to explain reality, but no longer do. The Soviet Union did not first lose control of its streets. It first lost control of its balance sheets. And once that happened, everything else followed. For decades, the Soviet system survived by commanding outcomes on paper. Prices were fixed. Wages were guaranteed. Production targets were issued from the center and treated as law. The appearance of order was powerful. Bread cost what was told to cost. Steel mills produced what they were told to produce. Money existed, but it was not allowed to speak freely. It could not warn. It could not correct. It could not signal danger. Instead, it obeyed. Losses were absorbed by the state. Shortages were hidden behind queues. Inefficiency was buried beneath subsidies. The system did not ask whether something made sense. It only asked whether the plan had been fulfilled. Think about that. A modern industrial empire that treated money as a bookkeeping formality rather than a messenger of truth. This is where the contrarian thesis begins. The Soviet collapse was not triggered first by protest, nationalism, or political betrayal. Those came later. It was triggered by money losing its ability to coordinate reality. When prices stop reflecting scarcity, scarcity does not disappear. It spreads. When wages are guaranteed regardless of output, productivity does not stabilize. It erodes. And when trade is commanded rather than negotiated, value slowly drains from the system. The Soviet Union could launch satellites into orbit, yet it could not calculate the real cost of producing bread. That contradiction is not poetic. It is fatal, because when money stops working, nothing else can work for long. The danger was invisible because the system was designed to hide it. There were no stock market crashes to signal panic, no public debt auctions to fail on television, no currency traders forcing humiliating devaluations in real time. Stability appeared absolute, but that stability was enforced, not earned. The economy was sealed off from external correction. Inside that sealed space, distortions piled up year after year. Factories met targets by producing unusable goods. Farms met quotas by wasting harvests. Ministries reported success because failure was not an option. On paper, the system advanced. In reality, it drifted. And drift is the most dangerous form of decline because it feels like motion. Inside the Soviet state, money became a promise rather than a measure. A wage promised survival. A price promised affordability. A plan promised abundance. But none of these promises were grounded in real exchange. They were grounded in authority. As long as authority held, the promises held. But authority itself depends on credibility. And credibility in the modern world depends on whether money can still connect effort to reward, cost to price, and supply to demand. Once that connection weakens, authority becomes performance, orders become theater, and the economy becomes a story the state tells itself, hoping reality will listen. Imagine the quiet tension inside those offices as contradictions grew. Reports arriving from factories that met quotas but could not repair machines. Warehouses full of goods no one wanted. Shops empty of goods everyone needed. The numbers still balanced on paper because they were forced to, but the real economy was already splitting from the reported one. This is not collapse as spectacle. This is collapse as silence. A slow widening gap between what the system claimed and what people experienced. And gaps like that do not stay manageable. They widen until something breaks. The stakes were enormous because the Soviet economy was not just an economy. It was a foundation of political control, military power, and global influence. The army depended on factories. Factories depended on inputs. Inputs depended on coordination. And coordination depended on money behaving honestly. When that chain weakens at any point, the entire structure begins to wobble. An empire can survive military defeat. It can survive political unrest. But it cannot survive an economy that no longer tells the truth to itself. Once lies become structural, collapse becomes mathematical. This is why the usual explanations feel incomplete. Ideology did not suddenly stop working in the late 20th century. It had been strained for decades. Public faith did not evaporate overnight. It eroded unevenly, often quietly. What changed was something colder and more decisive. The cost of maintaining the illusion became higher than the system could absorb. Subsidies ballooned. Waste multiplied. External trade can no longer cover internal inefficiency. The math stopped cooperating. And math does not negotiate. It does not care about slogans, history, or sacrifice. It only balances or does not. The Soviet leadership faced a trap of its own making. To admit the truth meant exposing decades of distortion. To continue hiding it meant compounding the damage. Reforms promise correction, but correction requires pain. And pain threatens control. So the system hesitated. It adjusted at the margins. It delayed the reckoning. Each delay made the eventual correction sharper. Think about that. Not collapse through shock, but collapse through postponed honesty. When the truth finally emerged, it arrived all at once, overwhelming the system's ability to respond. This chapter is not about villains or heroes. It is about mechanisms, about how modern power rests not just on force, but on coordination. And coordination rests on money doing its job. When money is reduced to a political instrument, it stops being an economic one. It stops warning. It stops guiding. It stops disciplining. And when that happens, failure does not look dramatic at first. It looks like normal life continuing under strain, until strain becomes fracture. The Soviet Union did not wake up one morning and collapse. It drifted there year by year, decision by decision, subsidy by subsidy. Each intervention meant to preserve stability actually weakened it. Each guarantee meant to protect citizens eroded the system's ability to adapt. Balance sheets became stories. Targets became rituals. And reality waited patiently. Because reality always does. It does not argue. It accumulates pressure. And pressure, once released, does not care about intentions. This story asks a harder question than most documentaries are willing to ask. For much of the 20th century, the Soviet system appeared immovable. From the air, it looked like a machine designed to last forever. Industrial cities stretched across frozen landscapes. Rail lines cut through forests and plains like arteries. Smoke rose from factories day and night, signaling motion, output, purpose. To citizens inside the system and observers outside it, this scale communicated strength. Steel poured from blast furnaces. Oil flowed from distant fields. Grain moved by the ton. The state promised work for everyone, bread for everyone, shelter for everyone. And for long stretches of time, it delivered just enough to make the promise believable. Stability became the message. Permanence became the myth. Central planning replaced markets entirely. Decisions that elsewhere emerged from millions of exchanges were compressed into ministries and committees. Targets replaced prices. Quotas replaced competition. Output replaced profit. The question was never whether something should be produced, only whether it could be produced in the required amount. And this approach produced visible results. Cities rose quickly. Heavy industry expanded at breathtaking speed. Military capacity grew until it rivaled any rival on Earth. From the outside, this looked like proof that the system worked. It looked like evidence that chaos had been conquered by design. Imagine the scale of coordination involved. Trains carrying coal across thousands of miles. Ships moving oil through icebound ports. Factories synchronized to feed one another without markets to guide them. All of it directed from the center. No stock exchanges. No speculative bubbles. No televised panics. The absence of familiar capitalist crises reinforced the illusion. If there were no crashes, then perhaps there were no cracks. If the currency did not fluctuate, then perhaps it was stable. If employment was guaranteed, then perhaps productivity was irrelevant. The system projected calm because it forbade turbulence. But beneath that calm sat a dangerous assumption. That growth could be commanded without cost. That inefficiency could be neutralized by authority. That scarcity could be solved by decree. Losses did not disappear. They were absorbed by the state. Waste was not eliminated. It was hidden. Shortages were not corrected by prices rising. They were managed with cues, rationing, and patience. The economy did not respond to signals. It responded to orders. And orders are powerful, but they're also blunt. Money existed everywhere in the system, but it played a strange role. It paid wages, but it did not reward efficiency. It set prices, but it did not reflect scarcity. It moved goods, but it did not allocate them rationally. Money became symbolic rather than functional. A worker earned a salary regardless of output quality. A factory met its quota regardless of usefulness. A ministry balanced its books regardless of waste. On paper, everything aligned. In reality, value drained away quietly. Think about that. An economy that measures success by volume, not by usefulness. Foreign trade helped sustain the illusion. Energy exports, especially oil and gas, brought in hard currency. That currency paid for technology, food, and consumer goods that the system struggled to produce efficiently on its own. These imports smoothed daily life and masked internal decay. As long as exports flowed and global conditions cooperated, the system could postpone reform. Revenue bought time. It did not buy resilience. The deeper structure remained unchanged. Productivity lagged. Innovation slowed. Incentives weakened. But the light stayed on, and that was enough to convince many that the foundation was solid. Strength was measured in tonnage and territory. Miles of rail. Number of factories. Size of the workforce. These metrics were easy to display and hard to question. They filled reports and speeches. They reassured leadership and intimidated rivals. But they avoided the harder measurement, value. How much did it really cost to produce this steel? Was this factory improving or merely surviving? Were resources flowing to where they mattered most? Those questions were dangerous because they challenged authority. And in a system built on certainty, dangerous questions were rarely welcomed. The absence of visible crisis became proof of success. There were no mass layoffs, no sudden bankruptcies, no collapsing banks. Stability was enforced, and enforcement worked. But enforcement cannot create efficiency. It can only freeze patterns in place. Over time, those patterns hardened. Outdated technology remained in use because replacing it disrupted targets. Poor management persisted because failure carried political risk. Innovation slowed because experimentation threatened control. The system became very good at doing what it already did, and very bad at adapting to what it did not expect. Closed systems accumulate pressure. That is not a metaphor. It is a rule. When information cannot flow freely, errors cannot be corrected early. They compound. Small inefficiencies become structural flaws. Minor shortages become chronic gaps. In the Soviet economy, pressure built in subtle ways. Spare parts became harder to find. Repairs took longer. Quality declined. Workers adapted by lowering effort because extra effort brought no reward. Managers adapted by manipulating reports because honesty brought punishment. Everyone learned how to survive the system, not how to improve it. From the outside, this adaptation looked like resilience. Inside, it was erosion. The economy continued to function, but with growing friction. Each year required more input to achieve the same output. Each promise required more subsidy to sustain. Each success story required more omission. The illusion held because the system was insulated from feedback. Prices could not rise to signal shortage. Wages could not fall to signal inefficiency. Exchange could not adjust to signal value. The language of economics was muted. Only the language of authority remained. Imagine the tension this created at the center. Leaders received reports that showed fulfillment and progress. At the same time, they heard complaints about shortages and delays. Both were true. The system could produce massive quantities, yet fail at basics. It could dominate heavy industry while struggling with consumer goods. It could impress rivals while frustrating citizens. This contradiction was not accidental. It was baked into the design. When success is measured by output alone, quality becomes optional. When survival is guaranteed, improvement becomes unnecessary. The illusion of strength was reinforced by comparison. Other economies suffered visible crises. Recessions, inflation, unemployment. The Soviet system appeared immune. That immunity became a point of pride. It justified rigidity. It discouraged reform. Why change what seems to work? But immunity was an illusion, too. The crises existed. They were simply internalized. Instead of layoffs, there was underemployment. Instead of inflation, there were shortages. Instead of bankruptcies, there were subsidies. Pain did not disappear. It was redistributed in ways that were harder to see. As long as the system remained closed, this balancing act could continue. Pressure could be absorbed. Adjustments could be delayed. The state could intervene endlessly. But the cost of intervention rose each year. Subsidies expanded. Administrative complexity multiplied. Coordination became heavier. The machine required constant correction to maintain the appearance of smooth motion. And machines that require constant correction are not stable. They are brittle. The illusion held because it had to. To admit structural weakness would undermine legitimacy. To expose inefficiency would invite comparison. To allow money to speak honestly would reveal uncomfortable truths. So the system chose silence. It chose control over correction. It chose continuity over adaptation. And for a time, that choice worked. The trains ran. The factories smoked. The numbers added up. But only because reality was being postponed. This chapter is about that postponement. About the cracks did not announce themselves with sirens or speeches. They arrived quietly, disguised as inconvenience. A shipment delayed. A machine idle for lack of a single part. A store shelf emptier than it was supposed to be. In cities built to project permanence, absence became noticeable. Not dramatic absence. Subtle absence. The kind that forces people to adapt without fully understanding why. The Soviet economy did not break all at once. It began to hesitate. And hesitation, in a system built on command, is a warning sign. As the global economy shifted, the Soviet system struggled to keep pace. Technology advanced elsewhere at a speed the planned economy could not match. Productivity gain slowed. Factories kept producing, but the gap between effort and outcome widened. More labor produced less value. More resources generated diminishing returns. This was not immediately visible in official reports, because reports measure volume, not efficiency. But reality does not run on reports. It runs on inputs and outputs. And the balance between them was deteriorating. One of the most important buffers had been external trade. Energy exports brought in hard currency that could be used to import food, machinery, and technology. That currency acted as a pressure valve. When domestic inefficiency rose, imports filled the gap. When planning failed, trade compensated. But buffers are only useful as long as conditions hold. When global prices shifted and revenues fell, that valve tightened. Suddenly, the system had to rely more heavily on itself. And that was where the real weakness lay. This is where the core mechanism reveals itself. The state could create money, but it could not create value. It could print currency, but it could not print spare parts. It could promise wages, but it could not promise goods. For decades, money had been used as a political instrument rather than an economic one. Prices were fixed not to reflect reality, but to preserve stability. Wages were guaranteed not to reward productivity, but to maintain order. When these controls loosened even slightly, the truth surged forward. Reforms were introduced cautiously, almost reluctantly. The goal was to improve efficiency, without surrendering control. But efficiency requires feedback, and feedback requires honesty. As controls weakened, prices began to rise, not because greed appeared overnight, but because scarcity was finally allowed to speak. Goods that had been underpriced for years suddenly revealed their true cost. Inflation was not created in that moment. It was released. Think about that. Decades of distortion correcting themselves in months. Enterprises that had survived comfortably under protection now face exposure. Costs they had never accounted for became unavoidable. Supply chains that had relied on guaranteed inputs began to fracture. A factory could meet its quota only if every upstream supplier functioned perfectly. Once that chain weakened, the entire structure stalled. Delays multiplied. Warehouses filled with unusable goods while essential items vanished. The economy did not collapse from lack of effort. It collapsed from lack of coordination. This was not a revolution of crowds. It was a reckoning of math. Numbers that had been managed, adjusted, and suppressed for years suddenly demanded alignment. The currency lost credibility because it no longer represented a stable claim on goods. Savings lost meaning because prices no longer obeyed promises. Trust eroded, not in ideology first, but in exchange. When people stopped trusting money, they stopped trusting the system that issues it. Trade networks began to fracture along invisible lines. Regions realized that resources were flowing out without fair return. Subsidies that once felt abstract now felt personal. The logic of the system, which had relied on collective endurance, began to break down under individual pressure. Why produce more if it brought no benefit? Why send resources elsewhere if shortages existed at home? These were not ideological questions. They were practical ones. And the system had no good answers. The center depended on money to coordinate production across vast distances. When that coordination failed, authority weakened. Order still came, but compliance became uneven, not out of rebellion, but out of impossibility. You cannot command goods that do not exist. You cannot enforce prices that no one believes. You cannot plan efficiently without reliable signals. Political authority follows economic authority, not the other way around. Once the economy stopped responding, politics lost its leverage. The turning point did not feel dramatic in the moment. There was no single day when everything broke. Instead, there was a growing sense that the rules no longer worked. That promises were provisional. That stability was temporary. People adapted quickly because they had to. Informal markets expanded. Barter returned. Personal networks replaced official channels. These adaptations kept life moving, but they also undermined the formal system further. Each workaround was a vote of no confidence. Inside the state, the dilemma deepened. Tighten control and risk suffocating what little flexibility remained. Loosen control and risk unleashing forces that could not be contained. Every option carried cost. Every delay amplified the eventual impact. The system had been designed to avoid sudden change. That design now worked against it. Correction required speed, but structure demanded caution. The result was paralysis. Money had once been the glue holding the system together. Now it became the solvent dissolving it. Prices rose unevenly. Wages lagged. Contracts lost meaning. Planning lost credibility. When coordination breaks down at scale, fragmentation follows naturally. Regions, enterprises, and individuals begin to act independently, not because they want to, but because central solutions no longer function. This fragmentation was not political at first. It was economic. Politics followed. Think about how fragile trust really is. For years, people tolerated shortages because they believed the system was stable. Once stability vanished, tolerance vanished with it. Expectations changed faster than institutions could adapt. The social contract, built on guaranteed provision, unraveled when guarantees failed. That unraveling did not require speeches or slogans. It required empty shelves and rising prices. It required time. The ruble did not collapse because of external attack. It collapsed because it had been stripped of its role as an honest measure. Once money stops measuring reality, it becomes noise. And economies cannot coordinate on noise. Every transaction becomes uncertain. Every plan becomes speculative. In that environment, production slows, trade shrinks, and trust evaporates. The system enters a downward spiral. Not because people stop working, but because work stops connecting to outcomes. When the collapse finally became visible, it wore a political face. Borders shifted. Flags were lowered. Governments dissolved and reformed under new names. To the outside world, it looked like ideology imploding in real time. But by then, the damage was already done. The economy had broken first. Politics was only reacting to what money had already decided. Factories shut down not because the doctrine ended, but because inputs vanished. Supply chains failed. Currency no longer functioned as a reliable claim on goods. The system had reached a point where it could no longer reproduce itself. For ordinary people, the transition was brutal. Savings that had taken years to accumulate evaporated almost overnight. Wages lost meaning as prices raced ahead. Trade froze because no one trusted contracts. Goods appeared and disappeared without warning. People who had lived their entire lives under guaranteed stability were suddenly forced into improvisation. Survival economics replaced planning. Informal markets filled the gaps. Barter replaced cash. Personal networks mattered more than official channels. This was not liberation as promised in theory. It was disorientation in practice. The collapse did not distribute pain evenly. Those who controlled physical assets, resources, or access to currency moved quickly. Factories, land, and infrastructure were sold cheaply, often under pressure and confusion. Value shifted hands at a historic scale. Power consolidated around those who understood the new rules fastest. This was not an accident. When institutions collapse faster than norms conform, advantage goes to speed, not fairness. The economic vacuum rewarded aggression and punished patience. The state that emerged from the ruins was weaker, smaller, and fundamentally different. It no longer commanded production. It negotiated with it. It no longer guaranteed outcomes. It managed risk. The global balance shifted as well. A superpower exited the stage, not defeated militarily, but bankrupted structurally. The end of the Cold War is often framed as a triumph of one system over another, but the deeper truth is colder. One system collapsed under the weight of its own distortions. The other simply outlasted it. This is where the Soviet story becomes uncomfortable, because it refuses to stay in the past. Modern states still manage prices, subsidies, and debt. They still delay correction for political comfort. They still confuse output with value. They still treat money as a tool of policy rather than a messenger of reality. These choices feel safe in the short term. They buy time. They preserve calm. But they also accumulate pressure. And pressure does not disappear. It waits. Think about how collapse really happens. Not with chaos first, but with distortion. Not with rebellion, but with mispricing. Not with slogans failing, but with coordination breaking. The Soviet Union is not a warning about communism alone. It is a warning about silencing feedback, about refusing correction, about mistaking stability for health. Any system that mutes its own signals risks the same fate, regardless of ideology. Money is not just currency. It is information. It tells societies what is scarce, what is valuable, and what is sustainable. When that information is suppressed, societies lose their ability to adapt. They continue forward confident until reality forces adjustment all at once. When that moment arrives, it feels sudden, but it never is. It is a result of years of delayed truth. Empires do not fall only because they are challenged. They fall because they stop listening to the systems that keep them coherent. The Soviet collapse shows what happens when an economy becomes performance rather than a process, when reports matter more than results, when promises matter more than prices, when authority matters more than coordination. Once those priorities invert, collapse is not ideological. It is inevitable. This story matters because it explains power in its most fragile form. Not power as force, but power as balance. Balance between effort and reward, between cost and price, between promise and delivery. Lose that balance, and even the largest system becomes hollow. It may look strong, it may sound confident, but it cannot respond when conditions change. And change always comes. The Soviet Union fell quietly before it fell loudly. By the time the world noticed, the decision had already been made by the numbers. The lesson is not dramatic. It is structural. Ignore money's message long enough, and it stops whispering. It shouts. And when it does, history moves fast. If this story reshaped how you see collapse, power, and money, subscribe for more cinematic histories that go beneath the surface. And share this documentary with others who want to understand how empires really fall.